Welcome to the American Indian and Alaska Native Behavioral Health webinar series. I'm Kate Trams, and today we have invited Dr. Andrew Finch to present on recovery schools. This training series is brought to you by the National American Indian and Alaska Native Addiction Technology Transfer Center. We are one of 4 national focus centers serving the ATTC network. The network also includes 10 regional centers and a network coordinating office. To learn more about the network, please visit our website. The next session in this series is scheduled for Wednesday, May 6th, when we will welcome Dr. Beth Boyd, Director of the University of South Dakota Psychological Services Center, to present on community-based psychological first aid. We also offer the Essential Substance Abuse Skills webinar each month. The next session in this series will be held on April 15, when Dee LeBeau-Hein will present Referral, Service Coordination, and Documentation. Our center is a NADOC certified educational provider, and we'd be happy to provide you with CEHs for a $15 fee. The request form is available for download in the Files pod in the webinar screen. I will also be sending this form in a follow-up email to all who attended. Immediately following today's webinar, you'll be redirected to our GPRA evaluation. GPRA stands for the Government Performance and Results Act, and SAMHSA asks us to evaluate our events in order to comply with this act and to provide improved performance assessment and accountability. This survey asks about your satisfaction with the event and will take less than 10 minutes to complete. We thank you in advance for helping us to improve our programs. Before we start today's session, I'd like to go over a few instructions for the Adobe Connect system. To view the presentation in full screen mode, click on the full screen button at the top right corner of the presentation pod, which looks like 4 arrows pointing outward. To return to the regular view, click the button again. You'll be muted for the duration of this webinar. Please use the Q&A pod to share your questions and comments, and we will address questions at appropriate points during the presentation. We would also like you to be aware that this webinar records participant attention time. If you minimize the webinar or are working in another window, the system will record your participation as inactive, which may be reflected in the number of CEHs received. The opinions expressed in this presentation are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the official position of CSAT, SAMHSA, or the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Today's webinar is presented by Dr. Andrew Finch. Dr. Finch is an associate professor of the Practice of Human and Organizational Development at Vanderbilt University. He is also the co-founder of the Association of Recovering Schools and has been widely published on the topic of recovery schools, and also with his work in working as a school counselor. He's developed a great deal of programs on creative community recovery programs, and we're excited to have him here today to tell us more about recovery schools. So I'm going to pull up your slides, Dr. Finch, and we thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Kate. I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to say regarding recovery high schools, and thank you to all the participants for joining today. This is a topic, as mentioned in the introduction, that's something that I have done for a number of years now professionally, and it's also the center of my research work. I did help start and run a school in Nashville, Tennessee for just under 10 years that was a recovery high school, and as part of my work with the Association of Recovery Schools, have become very familiar with schools across the country, and in my research actually have visited most of the existing recovery high schools and spent a lot of time trying to understand how they operate and currently trying to figure out how much of a difference they make in the lives of the students who attend those programs. I want to start by acknowledging some of the support that we have received from the federal government to support that research, working currently on our second grant funded by the National Institute on Drug Abuse. The first was a descriptive of about 17 schools that I will talk about today, and that informs much of my knowledge of the schools in the country. And currently, I'm working on the first national outcomes study comparing students who attend high schools to students who don't attend recovery high schools as far as the effects of Recovery High Schools on academic outcomes and therapeutic outcomes. And I'll talk at the end of the webinar today about some preliminary findings from that study. So, setting the scope of this issue, adolescent treatment in the United States really dates back to the 1970s, and historically hasn't been something that we've seen tremendous outcomes as far as long-term abstinence from alcohol and drug use. And we also know that quite a number of young people require treatment every year. The National Household Survey every year found about 1.3 million youths, and that's age 12 to 17, who needed treatment in 2013, the last time they collected this data. And of those 0.3 million, 122,000 received treatment at some type of specialty facility, so something that we might regard as residential treatment or outpatient treatment, in which they were getting some type of specialty treatment for their use. Now, you'll realize that's less than 10% of the youths that actually need treatment are getting it. And that's something that we call the treatment gap. And that's been well documented. There's a number of racial disparities that we see in those numbers. And it's a large number of young people who could benefit perhaps from treatment that don't receive it for one reason or another. Sometimes it's personal choice, sometimes it's systemic, but that's a large number of students and young people that don't get treatment. There's another gap that I want to bring to your awareness, and that's something that I would call a continuing care gap. So of the 9 or 10% of young people that actually do get treatment, a much smaller percentage actually get ongoing continuing care once they leave treatment. And my belief is that's one of the reasons that we see the outcomes that we do, which tend to be low levels of extended abstinence from alcohol and drug use once they finish treatment, and often a return to the prior levels of use that they had before they even went to treatment. And so some of the studies that have been done on this have determined that treatment really does consistently yield use, but that 35 to 75% of all teens relapse after leaving treatment. And that seems like a pretty large differential, 35 to 75%. But that tends to be how those how things are being measured, how many people they're able to reach following treatment. So who's doing the study, the quality of the study. But anywhere from a third to three-fourths of all young people are using again once they leave treatment. And one study done by Ken Winters and colleagues found that almost half of all students returning to non-recovery high schools had resumed full-blown drug use within a year later. So they were back to their prior level of use in about a year. And what we've learned is that it's probably not the best thing to do to gauge the success of treatment on whether or not a student uses or doesn't use again. Because we've learned that substance abuse and dependence is something that is chronic, and it's something that relapse tends to be a norm. Young people and adults both would be more expected to use again than not, and that their multiple treatment episodes tend to be the norm rather than one that solves the issue forever. And so if that's true, if this is some type of chronic situation, and if it's a situation where repeated treatments or repeat use are the norm, then the logic would follow that what happens both following treatment and following the return to use is critical. And so if relapse is something that we expect is going to happen, then what happens once a young person uses drugs again following treatment seems to hold some importance. And it seems to offer a fork in the road, so to speak, to where a person could go down a pathway of resuming the same level of alcohol and drug use they had before, or perhaps they take a step away from that and they realize this isn't what I wanted to do. And maybe it's not something that goes into full-scale relapse right away. And And the belief would be that if we can keep it from going down the path towards full-blown use again, that maybe we can get it to a place where that young person won't be regularly using alcohol and drugs during the rest of their life. So one program modality that has been set up really to deal with that piece of things, the continuing care component for young people, is a recovery high school. And the recovery high schools have been around since the late 70s. 1979 is when the first one opened. Since that time, there have been roughly 75 to 80 recovery high schools that we know have existed at some point in time. And right now, there's about 35 or so currently operating, which is the most that have ever been currently operating at one time that we're aware of. And so this is something that has shown steady growth over time, but also very dynamic as far as a number of school closures over the years. And part of what I'll try to break apart for you today is why we think that might be happening. But the point of the recovery high schools is to support students in their recovery in the school setting, realizing that young people are going to be in school a good portion of their day, 7, 8 hours a day, sometimes more, sometimes less, but roughly 7 or 8 hours of every day. A young person is going to be in school. It's where they form their peer groups. It's oftentimes where they use drugs, where they get drugs. And so to the extent that a safe place can be created that a student doesn't feel bombarded by drug use and feels supported in their desire to not use alcohol or drugs, then again, the logic would follow that perhaps they'll focus more on the academics of why they're there, as well as building positive peer relationships and healthier behaviors. And last year, the National Institute on Drug Abuse released their Principles of Adolescent Substance Use Disorder Treatment. And in that guide, they actually mentioned recovery high schools as a program modality that could be helpful to adolescents. And this is a quote on the screen from that guide saying that recovery schools can serve as an adjunct to formal substance use abuse treatment, with students often referred by treatment providers and enrolled in concurrent treatment for other mental health problems. So as I mentioned, recovery high schools have existed since the late 1970s. And as I have worked with schools across the country, I've realized that there tends to be quite a bit of confusion about what actually defines a recovery high school. We know there are therapeutic boarding schools, often residential placements for up to a year, in which students are going to school while they are there. There are treatment centers in our country that have schools on their property and have schools for kids to attend. There are alternative schools that might have a chemical dependency counselor on staff. So there's a variety of programs that exist in which students are getting treatment for substance abuse and or mental health, a co-occurring disorder, and they're getting an education. And all of those programs have value and are important. And one thing that we need to understand is how are recovery high schools, say, different from other programs? How do we distinguish what would be a recovery high school from those other programs that I've just mentioned? And the Association of Recovery Schools, which formed in 2002, has spent the last few years trying to create those defining elements of a recovery high school to help people such as yourself understand what that program is, and if it's something that you think your community could benefit from, an easier way to advocate for that because you have a common language to describe it. And so the Association of Recovery High Schools came up with 4 definitional components of a recovery high school. And the first 2 are listed on your screen now. The first is that the primary purpose is to educate students in recovery from substance use and co-occurring disorders. Primary purpose being the key word there. As I mentioned, there's a number of treatment and mental health treatment programs that have schools that they work with or are part of their program. In all of those cases, the primary purpose is for that student to get treatment. It's to receive the mental health or substance use treatment that they need, and because they're there for a prolonged amount of time, or at a level of intensity, they need to get schooling while they're there, and so they've created a school. But really, the primary purpose is treatment. The recovery high schools, the primary purpose is to help a student complete their education. They are schools. When you visit the recovery high schools around the country, they identify as a school first and foremost. And that doesn't mean that they somehow put down the recovery component or say that that is not an important part of what they do. It is. It's integral to what they do. It defines in large part what they are, but a school is their first identity. They exist to provide an education to the students who enroll, which leads to the second point. They have to meet state requirements for awarding a secondary school diploma. These are schools that are offering courses that count. They are courses that can lead to the completion of a diploma. Now, depending on when the student enrolls, they could get anywhere from a couple of credits while they're there to all 4 years of their education there. So that really depends on the school and when the student enrolls in that school. But the courses that they're offering are meeting the state requirements for awarding a diploma. In other words, they're not just tutoring or providing seat time for a student. They're actually providing credits that matter and would lead to graduation. By the way, I'll return here. The pictures that you see on these slides, this is actually a recovery school in Minneapolis that's housed in a church. This next slide is a community high school that's housed in a community center. It's a recovery high school, rather, housed in a community center. This particular facility, also in Minnesota, perhaps you could tell by the snow, has a number of programs housed in it. The school is just one of them. And so the recovery high schools have kind of existed where there's room for them to exist, and I'll talk about that more in just a moment. The last two of the four definitional components are that the school has an intention that all the students enrolled be in recovery and working a program of recovery from substance use or co-occurring disorders as determined by the student and the school. Keywords here are intent. There are a number of schools that operate as charter schools, and by many of the charter laws in this country, any student that wants to enroll in that charter can. You can't place a limitation like they have to have a substance use disorder to enroll. So by a lot of the charter laws, they require that any student be able to enroll there. So it's just clearly stated at the recovery school that the intention of this charter school or this program is to support students in recovery from substance use disorders. And in most cases, if you don't have that, then you're not going to be as interested in going to that program. But many of the charter schools have to create that distinction. But again, it's around intent, that this is the intention of the program. You'll also notice that it doesn't say that every student has to be diagnosed with a disorder. In most cases, it's a student self-identifying, a parent self-identifying, and for the vast majority, these are students who have received treatment for this issue. And so, again, intent, it's not something that students have to be assessed or diagnosed as having that substance use disorder in most cases. And as far as working some program of recovery, this is also pretty wide open. Depending on the school where it's located, there has been some beliefs that all the schools require students to work Alcoholics Anonymous or 12-step programs, and that's really not the case. The schools, it's actually a rarity that a school would require a 12-step program exclusively. It is true that that is still the most widespread type of support group in the country that's free, and so you're still going to see the vast majority of students in these schools who are accessing that, but it's not a requirement. And actually, in some cities, it's not even it's not legal to make that requirement because of the view that those programs are some type of religious programming and can't receive public funding. Not to mention the schools wouldn't want to affiliate with AA or NA because of the principles of those programs. And so these are not schools that are aligned by definition with 12-step programs, though many of them do lean on mutual aid groups for support. And then the final point is that they are available to any student in recovery who meets the state or district eligibility requirements for attendance. This is simply here to say that it's a distinction from a treatment program that's going to say this school is only available to the people getting treatment here or getting treatment in our facility. Rather, like a school, if you meet the eligibility requirements to attend that school, like a charter school, an alternative school, or even a private school, then you can attend that school whether or not you're receiving treatment in a facility. So again, that's the distinction that exists for point D. As far as the number of schools that exist around the country, this is a map I direct you to on the recoveryschools.org website. You can see the web link here as well. This is updated pretty regularly. You might have noticed earlier I said there's about 35 schools, or there have been about 75 or 80 that have ever existed. Bottom line is we just don't know all the schools that may be out there or all the schools that have ever existed. Many of these schools open as maybe one school in a state to a small number of students, and they may not be publicizing what they're doing. They may not even have an awareness that this number of schools are out there, and so they don't just pick up the phone and call the Association of Recovery Schools and say, hey, we're existing. So we feel like we have a pretty good idea of the number of schools, but I always believe there might be one or two more operating out there that we're not aware of. But you could see the map and how they're spread. There's a lot of gaps, and there's also some places where we see quite a few schools. So you can see there's a number of schools in Texas, California, in the Northeast, especially in Massachusetts, where there are 5 schools. And Minnesota at one time had 12 or 13 schools operating at the same time. Now there are 4, and there definitely was a condensing of the number of schools in Minnesota over the last few years. A lot of that was economic. Some of it was business planning. But we've seen an expansion across the country and a condensing of numbers in Minnesota in particular. Minnesota was actually the site of one of the 2 schools that I'm aware of that served Native American populations. A school that existed for probably just under 10 years in Cass Lake, associated with the Cass Lake Area Learning Center. If you're not familiar with area learning centers, they are alternative schools in the state of Minnesota that can enroll students from outside their district boundaries as long as they have any number of qualifying conditions. I think there's about 9 qualifying conditions, and one of those would be a substance abuse problem or substance use disorder. And that is one of the reasons we saw a large number of schools in Minnesota, because they had this policy that allowed for students to cross district lines to attend an alternative program if they actually had this issue. And so we saw an explosion of schools in the 1990s in Minnesota for this reason, in the early 2000s. And one of them was the Atashing program. And my understanding is the translation of Atashing is coal from old fire to start new. And this was a school that was very small. It tended to enroll about 10 to 12 students that was housed within the larger area learning center. There is still a program in Minnesota that operates this way, though it's not on a reservation, nor does it serve a primarily native population. But it's this idea of a school within a school, in which teachers from the alternative school are actually used for the recovery high school, one administrator, one building. So it's a very cost efficient. But in the case of this particular program, the district ultimately decided just to meld the 2 together and not create the distinction, and essentially closed the Atashing program just a few years ago. And my guess is it was philosophically they felt like 10 to 12 was not enough, or less than 10 was not enough to maintain it. And that's something that we've seen in a number of the smaller programs over time. But this was certainly a school that I think would be of interest to any of you that would want to look at bringing recovery high schools to a Native American population. Another school that's still operating, and not as familiar with this program, but it is in Arizona, and it is the Circle of Health Recovery School, part of the Children First Academy of Phoenix. This is a program that goes back to 2000, and it was founded as part of funding from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and its founder, Bonnie Beach, is still a part of that program. And I think this would be another program worth looking at. I have actually not visited this program, so I can't speak directly to it. But from what I understand about the program, it fits those definitional components that I stated before. And it is definitely serving a Native American population. And I think it also would be one that would align with the spiritual principles of the Native population of that area. And so I think it's definitely worth looking into more closely with regards to the specifics. And those are the two schools that I'm aware of that have specifically served Native populations. So talking about facilities, you've seen some pictures on the slide so far. I hope you're getting a sense that Recovery High Schools kind of shoehorn their way in to wherever they can fit. Some of the schools look traditional. Some of them are houses of faith. Some of them are like this picture. It's in an industrial plaza that they've just kind of, built out some office space and put a school in there. The 9 Recovery High Schools participating in our current study, 3 of them are in office complexes, 3 of them are in churches, 2 of them in community centers. 1 is actually in a traditional school building. In my time, I've seen them I saw one that was above a pizza restaurant in Colorado. That was a great lunch program for them. And another that was, believe it or not, housed in a saloon from the 1800s that they had converted as a historical structure, and they had put a school in the top part of that building. And so basically wherever they can find space is where they tend to open and operate. More on the actual components of Recovery High Schools. Admission requirements vary across the schools. Some of them actually do require a certain length of sobriety. In the first study that I mentioned, in which we visited 17 schools across the country, we found that the duration of sobriety for admission ranked from no requirement on up to 30 days. And I'm aware of a school in Houston, Archway Academy, that requires 60 days of sobriety. And so that does really vary. Again, it's going to depend on the population of the area and oftentimes access to treatment. If students don't have access to treatment, then it's harder for a school to place a requirement like 30 days or 60 days of sobriety if they want to have any students. And so access to treatment tends to drive what type of sobriety duration a school might implement. As far as recovery, most of these students, when they enroll, are in active recovery. We did find a couple that were bringing students in that still hadn't decided to be clean and sober. And they were, in most cases, providing some level of extra supports, maybe after school or extra counseling supports for those students. But by and large, most students were in active recovery or at least had made that decision to be in recovery from a substance use disorder. And so therefore the program was focused more on the recovery end. But again, you're going to see some variety there. And I would also say that there's a lot of possibility depending on the ways that a school could staff itself and what types of other programming it could provide, oftentimes after the school day or perhaps during the school day in a separate part of the building. Treatment history, most of the students had received some form of prior treatment, for many of them multiple prior episodes, but in most cases the schools were not requiring prior treatment. It was just that students had that, and that's often how they had heard of the school. But in most cases the schools weren't saying you had to have treatment, in part, again, because of some of the gaps in access for students. We did find that students would typically report that they had come to the school voluntarily. As you start to talk to more and more staff, though, you start to realize that, yes, students are there voluntarily by policy. They have to tend to say they want to be at the school, but you start to find out that perhaps their parents said things like, well, you have a choice, but it would be much better for you to go here than the alternative. Maybe they have probation officers that say the same thing, or judges that say, we look favorably upon you if you go to this school. In most cases, though, the Recovery High Schools were not considered punitive placements or forced placements. These were places that at least tried to get some buy-in from the students before they would enroll there, though sometimes it felt probably a little bit more coerced than the policies might state. As far as frameworks of recovery, most of the schools involve some form of daily group plus one-on-one counseling. They do have treatment professionals that are there, everywhere from coaches, recovery coaches, to licensed chemical dependency counselors, but they're providing some type of one-on-one support as well as daily group in most cases. Some of the schools that are smaller are able to have large groups maybe multiple times, maybe in the morning and in the afternoon. Um, but if they're larger, maybe the group happens once a day, maybe a couple of times a week. But daily groups tended to be the norm. All tended to use some form of uh, uh, variant of 12-step groups. But again, as I said earlier, they weren't aligning with that. And so they would have groups that tended to, when we visited them a few years ago, they tended to have more of a focus on that 12-step or Minnesota model. But they were incorporating a wide variety of things, including CBT, some level of harm reduction, especially around things like smoking and cigarette use, nicotine use. But when we visited the schools a few years ago, that tended to be much more the milieu than not. But not all of the schools today would even go that far and have anything that even resembled a 12-step group. So it's becoming less and less common today than it was in our initial study from which this data was pulled a few years ago. Therapeutic programs for the schools that we visited in our study, as I mentioned, pretty eclectic as far as the orientation of the counselors involved. Many of them were contracting with outside agencies depending on the resources that they had available to them. Some they were able to use school district staff to provide those services, but in many cases they were outsourcing that to local community agencies or partnering with an agency to provide the therapeutic support. And the credentials were all over the map. Licensed professional counselors, marriage and family therapists, alcohol and drug counselors, social workers, recovery coaches have become more common. They have school counselors. Some have school psychologists on staff. So again, it varies depending on the size of the program, the partnerships the program has built, and where it's housed and who they have availability to. So this really did vary. The one common theme was that they all were providing some level of therapeutic support during the day that definitely goes beyond what you would see in a traditional school, in a large traditional school, in which people might be on the staff, but it's unlikely that they'll be working closely with the students who are in recovery at the school. Again, from that initial study that we did that was much more descriptive in nature than our current study, we did survey 321 students across the country. And these were self-report surveys. We went to the site, visited the school, we gave them the survey. And in those 321 surveys, we found that 78% of the students reported having substance abuse treatment history, 54% inpatient, 55% outpatient. Some had multiple episodes. 49% reported a mental health treatment history. Now, again, this is a treatment history. Years ago, it used to be thought that very few adolescents would have mental health and substance use disorders. We know now through research that actually that is much more the norm than the exception, and that those percentages are actually pretty high. So again, about half of the students reported they had received some form of mental health treatment history, whether it was as part of the substance use treatment or in addition to the substance use treatment. And almost half had reported that they were currently receiving counseling or some type of treatment outside school. So they were receiving additional supports beyond the school day. About 48% of the students reported that. Regarding the academic programs, most of the schools were sharing school staff. Again, if you have a program that averages about 30 students, which is what we found the schools average, 20 to 30 students, the largest school today is about 100 students. The smallest is about 10. So there's a large range. And if we have programs that are that small, then they're going to have to share staff with other programs. And that's what most of them were doing. Now, if they were private schools or run by private agencies, then they might share staff across their agency. But most of the schools are public, whether they're public charters or public alternative schools. And in these cases, they may be sharing teachers with other charter schools in their cooperative or within a school within an alternative school. than teachers that are teaching both the alternative school population as well as the recovery school population. Usually we would find, though, that the students themselves didn't blend or didn't mix with those other students. Rather, the staff would go to the students rather than the students blending in with the other students in the building. Individualized learning, obviously possible with this small size of school, self-paced, often tutorial, helping students catch up, but very individualized instruction. And many of the schools were using externally created curriculum. Obviously, today, virtual schooling is becoming more and more common. We hear from a lot of the schools that the students often don't respond well to virtual curriculum as far as attention is concerned. And so the ones that are using the virtual curriculum often have a tutor or teacher assigned to work alongside students who are on computers to help them through that work. But that has allowed schools to offer perhaps accelerated or advanced coursework that they might not be able to offer, say, a Calculus 2 class if only one student in the school needs that, or perhaps a virtual program can help with that. So if you only have one or two students that need a subject, the virtual curriculum tends to help in that area. But in most cases, the schools have teachers for the major subject areas: English, math, science, social studies. They may have one teacher that's teaching across multiple grade levels because the size of the schools are so small. Now, we did ask each of the schools what their goals were. Were they striving to transition kids back into a regular school, graduate them, or both? And most of the schools had an intention to graduate students, as you could see. There were only a few that said their goal was to transition schools back into the mainstream school. And I would say that today that's probably even fewer. It's rare that the Recovery High School opens today that states that as their goal. Their goal is to help a student move towards graduation. And in many cases today, compared to the original schools, we see students spending most of their high school career, if not all of it, at a Recovery High School. And so that's becoming more common than it once was. However, what we realize is that most students, because of the trajectory of their alcohol and drug use, they may not need a program like this until their sophomore or junior year. And so most of the students aren't even enrolling in a Recovery High School until their third or fourth year in high school. And so they may only stay for a year or so, but oftentimes that's because of when they enroll rather than any set limit of length of stay, which typically does not exist. So again, the survey that I mentioned before, in which we surveyed about 321 students, and this was a few years ago, but we found that the average was about 19 students per school, ranging 2 to 46. It's probably closer to, say, 20 to 30 today, average number of schools, because we have a couple of schools that have gotten pretty large that would pull that number up from when we visited in the mid-2000s, 2006 to 2009 was when the first study ran. Mean length of stay was 232 days, just over 7.5 months, and it ranged anywhere from a student who started and left that same day, didn't even complete a day, on up to 4 years, which is almost 1,500 days of school. Gender breakdown, more male than female. That still seems to be the case. And demographics really do vary, although in our first study we definitely saw these tended to be students from middle to upper income families by and large. The Attaching program that I mentioned earlier in Cass Lake, Minnesota, actually was a predominantly low income program. The students in that school were very low income. But then we have other schools that are more private in nature that are predominantly upper income. And the way that treatment tends to work, we have seen a lot more upper income students access programs like this. So looking at more research, the current study that I'm involved in that is being funded by the National Institute on Drug Abuse is the first effort to really compare outcomes of recovery high schools to traditional schools. And if a student has received some form of alcohol or drug treatment, what we're trying to understand is, do students who go into recovery high schools do better? And if they do, how? How much better? In what ways do they do better? And so we receive funding for a 5-year study of recovery high schools. And the goals are to see, as I mentioned, are recovery high schools effective in preventing relapse from substance use for students in recovery from substance use disorders? And so looking at the alcohol or drug use, are recovery high schools effective in preventing relapse? We also want to know, are they effective in improving academic outcomes? And so if we're looking at how students do in school, do we see that students who go to recovery high schools do better academically? And so again, this gets at really the two main goals of the schools. They are schools, but they're also working around a specific issue. So two of our main study aims are around those two issues. And in our study, we are enrolling participants who have received some form of alcohol or drug treatment, and we do a baseline study soon after they leave treatment, and then we follow up 3 months, 6 months, and 12 months later to see how students are doing. And this is a graphic just showing when we're enrolling students and how the design is set up. Now, it is a quasi-experimental research design because we did not feel that it would be ethical to tell a family they couldn't go to a recovery high school, or because if we believe that it's an effective program. And so we just, for obvious reasons, didn't want to create a study like that. And so what we're doing is creating a research design that looks at all of the students in the study and creates what's called a propensity score, so that we can compare student A to student B. Student A has been in a recovery high school, student B hasn't, and we're looking at the outcomes and comparing them, which means we have to find students in both groups that are similar enough so that their data actually is comparable, which means that we can't use every student that we enroll necessarily unless there's a matching student in the other condition. And I'll talk more about that in just a minute. The students and parents that are being recruited, and we also interview families as well as the students in our survey data, are being recruited from treatment facilities and recovery high schools in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Texas. Now, the data that I'm going to show you today is very preliminary and really has to be interpreted with caution because we're actually not finished with the study yet. It is a 5-year study, and we're in year 4. And so we're only using a small subset of our sample, and the sample is not complete. And so you can't find significance in the data because the sample is so small. So everything that I'm showing is just trying to show you a trend that we're seeing so far in the preliminary data. But again, it has to be used with caution. And we're only looking at this point at the 6-month follow-up data. And so the data that I'll talk about today is from the 6-month follow-up surveys that we've utilized. And you can see that encompasses about 159 youth interviews. So 83% of the participants actually have a 6-month follow-up interview, and that's about a total of 159 students. So you can see that at this point, that's still a pretty small sample size, but that's where this data is coming from. And what I'm going to focus on today are the outcome measures in substance use. And that includes days used of alcohol in the past 90 days, days used marijuana in the past 90 days, and days used other drugs in the past 90 days. So again, the data that I'm presenting today looks at students who have been in the study for 6 months, and in most cases that's 6 months post-treatment, and asks them, how many days have you used alcohol in the last 90, marijuana in the last 90, other drugs in the last 90? And we're also looking at academic, and again, student reports in this case of English and reading grades, math grades, and truancy over the last 90 days. I'm not going to spend a lot of time explaining this, but as I said before, we've created propensity scores that we estimated using a large number of covariates that were empirically derived to compare students in each group so that we were looking at like versus like. If you were to look at the entire sample, and this isn't just the 6-month group, this is everybody in the study to this point, you'll see about 237 students, and you can see that they are predominantly white, and you can see the breakdown of students across each category. And so when you start to create propensity scores, that means you have to leave students out. If you don't find a student in the recovery high school group that matches with the non-recovery high school group, you can't use them for the purpose of analysis. So you can see this is still an issue that I've started to really consider a social justice issue for recovery high schools, is how do they deal with this type of gap? Historically, they tend to say it's because of the treatment gap, but there are programs now that are offering levels of treatment as adjunct services that perhaps could start to cut into that sum, and I think are certainly worth exploring more to cut into what we see in the disparities in the numbers. And this is just from our study, but that's probably pretty representative of the recovery high schools in the country. Now, of the actual baseline characteristics of our match sample, we ended up with 108 cases that we could use. 56 recovery high school students and 52 non-recovery high school students. And in those 108 cases, you can see that the demographics have even more of a gap. Not that much, but a little bit more. Primarily outpatient treatment in both mental health and substance use. And you can see, very similar to our first study, students had a history of both. Baseline across the full 108 students, mean number of days used, 58 days out of 90 marijuana post-treatment, and then various mental health diagnoses, anxiety, depression, panic disorder, PTSD tended to be what we are getting reports of that students have as far as other issues. Now, the next two slides are going to look at the 6-month outcomes. And again, the numbers are pretty small, so these aren't significant because of the small sample size, but you can see the effect sizes are all positive towards favoring recovery high schools. And so effect sizes of 0.16, 0.32, and 0.20 as far as the effect of a recovery high school in the use of other drugs, marijuana, alcohol. And what this translates into is for students who attend a recovery high school compared to students who don't following treatment, we're seeing 5 fewer days of use of other drugs, 10 fewer days of use of marijuana, 4 fewer days of use of alcohol. And again, the litmus test is not complete abstinence, it's are there fewer days of use, and to the extent that there are, you start to see at least some effect on days of use from recovery high schools. And so these are actually statistically pretty positive numbers, even though the sample sizes at this point don't lend to significance. On the academic side, we see similar. What's interesting is you see a pretty small effect with truancy and a slightly larger effect with math and English. And again, if you're translating to grade point averages, increase of 0.34 points in math and 0.38 points in English. But based on these effect sizes, the truancy is almost essentially zero. So you're not seeing necessarily a lot of effect in this group on that area. And that's an interesting thing that we will explore more if that ends up bearing out in the final data. And so from this initial data, again, very preliminary, but it is positive, and it does allow us to really say that it's suggesting that recovery school programs can be successful in supporting young people, and clearly that they can be an important option in that continuum of care. And I would emphasize that, again, it's not whether or not a student uses, it tends to be what happens next. And in a recovery high school, if a student uses drugs or alcohol again, they tend to come back into a community that will hold them accountable for that. That will say, why didn't you call me up? Or why did you go do that instead of coming to talk with me, or we could see that this was coming. And a real encouragement for the student to get back to whatever positive behaviors they were exhibiting before, compared to a more traditional school environment in which that's much less likely to happen. It's much less likely that they will be able to find a group of people that are going to hold them accountable in that way. And a lot more likely they're going to find people who encourage them for returning to drug use and welcome them back, so to speak. And so again, that's one of the things to look at is the peer support structures that recovery high schools provide that traditional high schools do not. And because it's so small, the way to engage parents and involve parents in a way that a traditional school can really struggle. Parents often don't feel welcome into a lot of our traditional schools, whereas in a recovery school, they're not only welcome, they're viewed as an integral part to the extent that the parents want to participate. Again, I have to really be cautious about the results. I wanted to give you some taste of what we're seeing, but these are certainly not final. They're not something that we would be publishing at this point. They're just encouraging to see that they're trending in that direction. And the final analyses will include a larger, more diverse sample and focus on a much broader range of outcomes. In fact, the intake interview takes almost 90 minutes. That's how many things we're asking. And so our database of outcomes is large. So again, more to come with that. It's positive to this point. So at this point, I'll go ahead and take some questions. We have about 9 or 10 minutes left in our webinar, and I would welcome any questions. I know I moved through a lot of that quickly to give you an overview of what the recovery schools do. But I do see one question here about the barriers to enrollment. What kinds of barriers to enrollment that exist? And stigma, availability, awareness. I would actually say all of those tend to be barriers of enrollment. Stigma is certainly something that exists, though I would say that for most of the families that access recovery high schools, if they've been in some form of treatment, then the stigma around recovery is a lot less than a family that hasn't been. And so to the extent that the students access some form of treatment, there's probably a lot less stigma for that family than the family who hasn't. It's also a reason to think about how we can start bringing more treatment into the school site. Because if it's something that the school is just providing as part of what they do, there's a lot less stigma around services provided by a school than might be around what's provided by some type of other agency that the family might not trust, or that there might be some issues around accessing it. And so the other availability, with only 35 schools or so currently operating, access is certainly an issue for recovery high schools. Even if a family knows that one exists, if they don't have transportation to that school, or if it's a long transportation ride, they're a lot less likely to access it. I don't think it's any coincidence that the two largest recovery high schools right now, one in Minneapolis and one in Houston, Texas, are located right in the heart of their cities, right near public transit lines, bus lines or train lines. And so access is much less an issue for those schools than, say, ones that are operating in rural areas or even in suburban areas that are off of public transit lines. And so I think that's something certainly, and the fact that there's only 35, I mean, it's just, the numbers would say if you're in a state that doesn't have one, it doesn't matter what your public transportation is. But I think awareness, I think the more that we do things like this, there is more awareness. But I would venture to say, if I could poll the participants, many of you probably had a limited awareness, if any, about recovery high school. And I do think that is still an issue. It's better than it once was, but I think there's still maybe some confusion about what they are, if there's any at all of what they are. Another question, what factors are considered and how long a student may stay, and who's involved in the deciding? This tends to be determined on a case-by-case basis, and as I mentioned, most of the schools don't have a predetermined length of stay. This is one way that it differs from both alternative schools and treatment centers. Treatment centers usually have a defined maximum length of stay. Maybe it's 90 days, maybe it's 30 days, maybe it's a year, but it's predefined usually, and perhaps students can leave early, but they're not usually going to stay longer. The recovery high schools tend to not have that type of predetermined length of stay, and so it really is up to the family. And most of the schools would say the student can stay as long as they want up to graduation from high school. Uh, Now, students may decide to leave. Maybe they go back to full-blown use again. Maybe they, um, want resources that that school doesn't have, so they transfer back. Maybe they're feeling like in a good place, and they want to return to a traditional school and try that again. There's a variety of reasons, um, but usually that's something that the student would state some desire, or that the school would sit down with the family and make that decision. Now, in the case of relapse, I didn't talk a lot about that, but in most cases, relapses are handled case by case. And if a student really is expressing a willingness to work on whatever issues might have led to that relapse, the school really is willing to work with that student to allow them to stay. If this becomes something that's happening over and over and over again, or is something that a student has been doing for a long period of time, that a school finds out about, then they may ask the student to leave if they feel like they're not safe for the community. But that's usually determined on a case-by-case basis. Most of the schools do some form of drug screening, though that usually is something that's affirming the sobriety rather than trying to catch someone using, though in some cases that certainly can be used to catch somebody who's not being honest about their alcohol and drug use. Another question, if a community wanted to start a school, would I suggest building it into an existing school to utilize resources? You know, my suggestion there would be whatever would work in your community. I think personally, if I had to do it over again, I probably would build it into some type of existing school structure. The school that I ran in Nashville was completely private, tuition based. It was very expensive for that reason. And uh, and it was difficult to raise money to support a school like that because it was so expensive, and also really denied access to people who couldn't afford it. And so I definitely personally feel operating it in the public sector somehow is helpful to give access, unless you have a community agency that can provide services for free. But I think certainly utilizing other resources, whether it be, say, teachers from a charter district, teachers from within a larger school. I think these are things that all the schools need to think about. And I also think if you start a school, starting small is really important. You need to figure out what you're doing. Every district, every area, every community is different. The families are different. You need to kind of learn your community, learn what's going to be beneficial. Start small, learn, improve, and then if you create a strong enough program, more and more students will come. And so rather than looking at the schools that have 100 students and saying, I want to be that, perhaps looking at the schools that have 10 to 15 students and say, I want to start there and grow, and utilizing as many resources as possible. I was looking to see if there's any more questions. I thought I saw a hand point. And, Kate, I'm not sure exactly how to pull those questions up if I've not seen them.
Yes, I saw someone try to use the raise your hand function. Unfortunately, because we don't give microphone rights to participants, it doesn't work to submit your questions that way. So if you could type them into the Q&A pod, then we can respond to them that way. So just remind everybody, we've got a couple more minutes here if you want to submit any final questions. And yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Finch. This has been wonderful, very informative. I have one other question that I was wondering about. What kinds of negative feedback have you heard about recovery schools, or what kinds of complaints or concerns have you heard about them?
Yeah, I think, one that I think really holds water and one that does not. I'll start with the one that I don't think holds a lot of water, and that is that these aren't the real world, that we're taking students outside the real world, putting them in some type of protective thing that's not real to them. And I would argue that Recovery High Schools actually are much more real world for students than the traditional schools because they can really be themselves. They can talk about what their real problems are. They can get help from peers who have similar issues to them. And I think they can be a lot more authentic in a school like this. And they do get more supports, perhaps, but I don't think that necessarily makes them any less real. In most cases, these are schools where students are going home at night. So they're in their families, in their communities. They're not residential programs. And so they get plenty of that quote unquote real world after school. But during the day, they're authentic and getting perhaps a little bit more support. But I think that's one criticism that people have put out there that I'm not sure is valid. The other is that because of their size, they don't offer as much extracurricular activity, say a football team or something like this, other clubs that other schools might have. And I think that is a valid criticism. To the extent that that's something that's a real asset to a student, they may not be able to get that at the Recovery High School. And so the schools have been very creative in finding ways to partner with community centers, with local schools, so that kids can still do that. But that's not often the same as playing for your own high school football team or something like that. And to the extent that that's an important support for a student, that may not be something they're getting at a recovery school, and that is one of the reasons people ultimately transfer. And so there is a trade-off.
Wow, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing with us today. This has been a very informative session. So yeah, we greatly appreciate having you here with us and giving us your insight and your experience.
My pleasure.
So thank you everyone for joining us. I think that brings us to the end. If you have additional questions that you think of later, feel free to email me, and we will try to get back to you on that. And again, I'll just remind everyone we will be redirecting to our survey at this time, and so please stay on and take a few minutes to fill out that survey. Thank you again, Dr. Finch.
Thank you.
All right, have a great day, everybody.